Now look, I want you to sit with me for a minute on this one, because this is one of those stories that gets reported as a single headline moment, when really it's the ending of a story that's been quietly unfolding for months. It's late in a long negotiating season, the kind of week when insiders have been whispering that a deal was close. And then, without much warning to the public, the talks collapse. On the surface, this looks like just another failed round of political negotiations, the kind that happens and gets patched up a few weeks later. But if you look closer, and I mean really look, it tells you something about the pressures pulling at coalitions like this one right now. And most people who saw the headline tonight didn't realize what actually broke down in that room, or why it may not get fixed as quickly as everyone assumes. This touches the stability of the governing arrangement you're living under, whether you follow this closely or not, because coalitions decide whether legislation moves, whether budgets pass, whether the next year is defined by function or by paralysis. Here's what I want you to hold on to before we go further. There's a specific sticking point at the center of this collapse that nobody's saying plainly in public yet, and we're going to come back to it because it's the actual key to whether this alliance can be rebuilt. And there's a deadline coming up tied to other legislative business that may force a resolution one way or the other faster than anybody expects. Hold on to both. We'll get there. I've watched coalitions form and fracture for a long time now across more governing arrangements than I can count on both hands. And I want to walk you through this one slowly tonight, because the instinct with a collapse like this is to treat it as sudden, as if it came out of nowhere. It didn't. Nothing like this ever does. Stay with me, and we'll take it apart piece by piece, the way it deserves. To understand tonight, you've got to understand how coalitions actually get built and held together in the first place, because the mechanics matter more than the personalities involved. A coalition isn't a marriage of shared belief. It's a marriage of shared arithmetic, a collection of factions, none of which commands a majority on its own, agreeing to combine forces because the alternative is watching somebody else govern instead. That arithmetic works fine when the stakes are low and the concessions required of each partner are modest. It gets tested hard whenever a decision forces one partner to choose between the coalition's survival and its own core identity. Every decision echoes for years. What we're watching tonight is the echo of the original bargain struck when this coalition first formed. The specific compromises, some public, some quietly understood, that got each partner to the table in the first place. Every coalition carries what I'd call original sin, a handful of unresolved tensions that got papered over at formation because nobody wanted to blow up a workable arrangement before it even started. Those tensions don't disappear. They wait and they resurface exactly at moments like this. One, when a new issue forces the coalition to actually resolve what it always managed to avoid resolving before. Think about how these arrangements typically get built in the first place. Negotiators sit down after an election that produced no clear majority, and they face a choice: spend months hammering out every detail of a shared governing philosophy, which is slow and risks losing the moment entirely, or agree on a workable framework covering the issues that matter most urgently, while deliberately leaving the hardest, most divisive questions for later, a later that everyone privately hopes never actually arrives. Almost every coalition chooses the second path because the alternative is paralysis before governing even begins. That's not a failure of imagination. It's a rational response to the pressure of forming a government quickly. But it means every coalition is from day one carrying unexploded ordnance, issues deliberately left unresolved, waiting for a moment when circumstances force them onto the table. And circumstances always eventually force them onto the table, because governing produces a steady stream of decisions that can't be indefinitely deferred, budgets that must pass on a schedule, international commitments that come due, court rulings that force legislative responses. Sooner or later, one of those forcing events lands squarely on top of the exact issue the coalition partners agreed at formation not to discuss. That's usually the real story behind a sudden seeming collapse. Not a new disagreement, but an old, deliberately buried one, finally excavated by circumstances nobody could indefinitely postpone. Let me be precise, because the details matter more than anybody's spin. Coalition collapses generally traced to one of three structural fault lines. The first is an ideological fault line, a policy question on which the partners have genuinely incompatible positions, not just different emphases, and where a decision has to be made one way or the other with no comfortable middle ground. The second is a resource fault line, a fight over which faction gets credit, which faction gets ministries or committee chairs, which faction's voters see tangible wins from the arrangement. And the third, often the most corrosive, is a trust fault line, a sense on one side or the other that agreements made in private aren't being honored once cameras are on. That one partner is negotiating in bad faith or leaking selectively to embarrass the other. Watch which fault line is actually driving tonight's collapse, because it changes everything about how likely a repair is. Ideological fault lines are the hardest to fix, because you can't split the difference on a genuine values disagreement without one side feeling at lost. Resource fault lines are usually the easiest because more resources, more credit, more visible wins can often be found or manufactured to satisfy an aggrieved partner. Trust fault lines sit in between, fixable, but only with time, and only if the party that broke trust is willing to make a visible, costly gesture to rebuild it, not just issue a statement saying trust matters. Let me be even more precise about how to spot each fault line in the public statements that follow a collapse like this. When you hear leaders talk about fundamental differences or irreconcilable positions, listen closely. That language usually signals an ideological fault line, and it's a warning sign that reconciliation will take longer than optimists are predicting. When you hear complaints about not being consulted or not getting a seat at the table, that's almost always a resource fault line, and it tends to resolve faster, often within a single renegotiated committee assignment or ministerial portfolio. And when you hear the word trust itself used explicitly and repeatedly, we can no longer trust our partners. Good faith has been broken. That's the trust fault line talking. And history suggests these disputes take the longest to genuinely heal, even when a formal arrangement gets patched back together on paper. There's also a numbers-based way to read this. Look at how many seats or how much voting share each faction actually commands relative to when the coalition first formed. If the arithmetic has shifted by even a handful of percentage points, that shift alone can explain a collapse far better than any single policy dispute, because it changes what each partner believes they can get away with and what they believe they need from the other side to survive. Now let me put my analyst hat on for a minute, because the strategy here is worth examining honestly. There are 3 reasons a coalition collapse like this one actually happens. And this is where I want to slow down, because the public explanation and the real explanation rarely match. Reason 1, a genuine change in the underlying arithmetic. Coalitions form based on the numbers at a particular moment. Seats held, votes commanded, public support measured. When those numbers shift through an election, a defection, or a change in public opinion polling, the incentive structure that held the coalition together shifts with it. A partner who was a necessary but junior member of an arrangement may suddenly calculate that going it alone or joining a different combination better serves their interests. That calculation, dry and arithmetic as it sounds, drives more coalition collapses than any single dramatic disagreement. Reason 2, a leadership transition on one side that changes the personal chemistry, and personal chemistry matters more in these negotiations than most outside observers appreciate. Coalitions are, in the end, run by individual people who have to trust each other enough to make deals stick without every detail being litigated publicly. A change in who leads one faction through a resignation, a primary challenge, an internal leadership vote can dissolve relationships that took years to build. And the replacement leadership may simply not have the same working rapport, or may actively want to distance themselves from an arrangement associated with their predecessor. Reason 3, and this is the one that gets underplayed in most coverage: outside pressure from each faction's own base. Coalition partners answer ultimately to their own voters and their own most committed supporters, not to each other. When a faction's base starts to see the coalition as a source of embarrassment rather than achievement, when primary challengers start gaining traction by running against the coalition itself, leadership faces enormous pressure to walk away, even if walking away costs the coalition's broader policy goals. Ask yourself which faction's base has grown most restless in recent months. That restlessness usually explains more than any single policy dispute reported in the headlines. There's a 4th dynamic worth naming too, even though it rarely gets its own headline: the role of media and messaging environments in accelerating a collapse that might otherwise have simmered quietly for months longer. In today's environment, every private grievance has a dozen outlets willing to amplify it instantly. Every disgruntled staffer has a platform. Every leaked text message becomes a permanent public record within hours. Coalitions used to be able to manage internal friction slowly, out of public view, giving negotiators time and space to work through genuine disagreements without the pressure of a live audience. That space has largely disappeared. Modern coalition negotiations happen with the equivalent of cameras in the room at every moment, and that visibility changes the incentives for everyone involved. It rewards public displays of toughness over quiet compromise, because a leader who's seen backing down privately loses standing with a base that's watching everything in real time. Now, I want to be fair here, because this isn't about one party, and it never really is. I've watched coalitions of every ideological stripe collapse for remarkably similar reasons. And I've watched partners on every side use the language of principle to describe what was underneath a pretty straightforward calculation about power and survival. And let me say something that won't be comfortable for anyone rooting for one side of this arrangement. The faction claiming the moral high ground in a coalition collapse is very often the faction that saw the least short-term cost in walking away. Principle and self-interest have a funny way of aligning perfectly at exactly the moment a decision needs to be justified publicly. I'll go further still, because fairness demands it. Both major sides of the political spectrum have, in different governments and different eras, been the partner that walked away and the partner that got walked away from. Neither side has a monopoly on coalition loyalty or coalition betrayal. If your instinct tonight is to assume your preferred faction is purely the wronged party in this collapse, that instinct is worth examining honestly, because it's exactly the kind of comfortable narrative that keeps us from understanding what actually happened. And here's a harder truth still, one that applies to us as an audience, not just to the politicians in that room. We tend to reward leaders who walk away dramatically more than leaders who stay and grind through difficult, unglamorous compromise. A dramatic exit generates headlines, clips, and fundraising emails. A quiet, patient negotiation that resolves a genuine disagreement rarely generates any of that, even though it's usually the harder, more valuable work. If we want fewer collapses like tonight's and more durable governing arrangements, the audience watching has to start valuing the unglamorous compromise as much as the dramatic walkout. Because right now, our attention rewards exactly the wrong behavior. Let me put my analyst hat back on and get to where this goes from here, because I see three roads out of this, and I want to be honest about all of them. Scenario A is the best case, and it happens more often than the initial drama suggests it will. Cooler heads prevail within a matter of weeks. Both sides recognize that the cost of a prolonged breakdown exceeds the cost of swallowing pride, and a modified arrangement gets negotiated, often with some cosmetic changes to save face for whichever side felt aggrieved, but substantively similar to what existed before. Coalitions collapse and reform with some regularity, and this pattern, while dramatic in the moment, is often more reversible than headlines suggest. Scenario B is the muddle, and is probably the most likely outcome given what we know tonight. The formal coalition doesn't reform, but an informal working arrangement emerges instead. Enough cooperation on critical votes to avoid total paralysis without the formal structure or shared branding of the original alliance. This is messier, less stable, and more vulnerable to future shocks. But it keeps the basic machinery of governance functioning while both sides quietly negotiate whether a formal reconciliation is worth pursuing. This muddled scenario tends to look, from the outside, almost indistinguishable from a healthy governing arrangement for weeks at a time, which is part of what makes it so common. Votes still pass. Statements still get issued. The difference only becomes visible when a genuinely hard issue comes up, one that requires the kind of trust and coordination a formal coalition provides and an informal arrangement doesn't. That's usually when scenario B either stabilizes into something closer to scenario A, with a formal arrangement quietly reestablished, or deteriorates into something closer to scenario C, when the next hard issue proves to be the one informal cooperation simply can't handle. And scenario C, this is the one that keeps me up at night. In this version, the collapse proves durable. The arithmetic genuinely shifts as one or more factions find new partners or new strategies for governing without the old arrangement. And what follows is an extended period of instability, repeated votes, shifting temporary alliances issue by issue, and a governing environment where nothing significant gets accomplished because no combination can hold together long enough to see a major initiative through. Let me be specific about what that instability actually cost in terms real people feel. It means major legislation stalls indefinitely, not because anyone opposes it outright, but because no stable majority exists to pass anything requiring genuine compromise. It means appointments to key positions sit vacant for months because confirmation requires exactly the kind of cross-faction cooperation that just collapsed. It means markets and institutions that depend on predictable governance start pricing in the uncertainty, which has real consequences for borrowing costs and investment decisions that trickle down to ordinary people far removed from the negotiating room. Instability is rarely dramatic in the moment-to-moment sense. It's a slow accumulation of things that simply don't get done month after month until the cumulative cost becomes impossible to ignore. My honest assessment, watching how these things have unfolded before, is that we're somewhere between scenario A and scenario B right now. But the specific sticking point I mentioned at the top will tell us which way this actually tips. Because if that particular issue gets resolved in the next negotiating round, the broader arrangement likely survives. If it doesn't, I'd start preparing for scenario C. Now let's come back to those loops because I promised you we would. The sticking point at the center of this, the one nobody's naming plainly yet, is the underlying resource or ideological disagreement that both sides have been managing quietly for months, dressed up publicly as a disagreement over something smaller and more manageable. And the deadline I asked you to hold on to, that's the point at which unrelated legislative business forces both factions back to the negotiating table, whether they want to be there or not. Because the machinery of governing doesn't pause just because a coalition is in crisis. Let me be straight with you as we close, because that's what I owe you after watching this pattern play out so many times before. Coalitions are fragile by design. That fragility is the price of representing more than one constituency under one governing roof. But fragile doesn't mean doomed. I've watched arrangements that looked finished come back together stronger once both sides remembered why they needed each other in the first place. I've seen this kind of instability before, in different forms and different eras, and I believe the underlying machinery of representative government tends to find its footing again, even after moments like this. One, but only if the people watching demand accountability rather than settling for theater. And let me leave you with the thing I actually believe most after watching enough of these collapses to lose count. Coalitions are not the story. They're the vehicle. The story is whether the people inside that vehicle are still trying to get somewhere for the voters who put them there, or whether they've started treating the vehicle itself as a destination, a source of titles, credit, and standing, worth preserving for its own sake rather than for what it was built to accomplish. Watch in the coming weeks whether the language coming out of this collapse is about policy outcomes or about political positioning. That distinction will tell you more about whether this alliance deserves to be rebuilt than anything said at tonight's podium. Don't just watch the headlines about who walked out of the room. Ask what specifically broke down, and ask your own representatives, whichever faction they belong to, what they're actually doing to fix it, and what they're actually trying to accomplish for you once it is fixed. That's what I'm asking you to think about tonight. God bless and take care of each other.